In this introduction to the section on rules of the air, we will look briefly at three issues. Firstly, at the origins of the establishment of rules of the air. Secondly, at the formulation by the International Civil Aviation Organization of rules of the air applicable to aircraft operating anywhere in the world. And finally, we will look at the basic concept of visual flight rules and instrument flight rules. Shortly after aircraft first flew at the beginning of the 20th century, rules of the air were established first of all by individual nations, and only later internationally. As time has progressed, the rules of the air have continuously evolved to cope with the ever-increasing sophistication of aircraft and the increasing density and range of aircraft movements. In the very early days of aviation, before the 1930s, few aircraft flew faster than 120 knots, and radio telephony communication between air and ground was a rarity. So many of the more basic rules of the air, which still apply nowadays, such as those dealing with landing priority and collision avoidance, were established to promote orderly and safe flight for non-radio air traffic, flying under visual flight rules in accordance with the principle of see and be seen. Therefore, many of the early rules of the air are still of great importance today for all aircraft, but especially for general aviation aircraft, which still fly predominantly under visual flight rules. Between the First and Second World Wars, to improve safety at aerodromes, many nations throughout the world passed legislation to enforce the rules of the air which had become established in their states. But with the rapid expansion in international air traffic following World War II, it soon became apparent that it was of crucial importance to standardize the rules of the air between the nations. Not unnaturally, then, the topic of rules of the air was one of the first matters discussed at the Chicago Convention on International Civil Aviation held in 1944. The rules of the air agreed by the member states of what became the International Civil Aviation Organization are found at Annex II to the Convention on International Civil Aviation. It is instructive to consider at this point the words on screen taken from Article 12 of the Chicago Convention, as they put into context the agreement reached between the member states of ICAO. ICAO member states are referred to as contracting states. Every aircraft flying over a state's territory and every aircraft carrying a territory's national mark, wherever it is, must comply with that territory's rules of the air. Each state shall keep its own rules of the air as uniform as possible with those established under the Convention. The duty to ensure compliance with these rules rests with the contracting state. Over the high seas, the rules established under the Convention apply. Thus, all contracting states to the Chicago Convention agree to try to keep their national rules of the air in line with the ICAO rules. When a contracting state enforces a rule which differs from the ICAO rules of the air, that state files a difference with ICAO. Subsequently, in the airspace over which that state has jurisdiction, that state's rule takes precedence over the ICAO rules. The Joint Aviation Authorities and the European Aviation Safety Agency are organizations which have undertaken to seek to normalize the aviation regulations of their member states by bringing them into line with ICAO standards. It can be expected then that in the airspace of a nation-state which is an ICAO contracting state, that nation will have attempted to align its national rules of the air with ICAO rules of the air. But where there are differences, it is always the national rules which take precedence. However, ICAO rules of the air apply without exception over the high seas. That is, over those sea areas lying outside the territorial limits of any nation-state. The situation of which rules of the air apply to which aircraft can be quite complex, because many member states, such as the United Kingdom, also require that their own registered aircraft observe the UK national rules wherever they fly, as well as complying with the rules of the air of the state in whose airspace the aircraft are flying. Always remembering, of course, that the rules of the air of the state being overflown take precedence. The only straightforward situation is that, while flying over the high seas, ICAO rules of the air apply. Because of the complexity of the issue of which rules take precedence, it is fairly easy to see that if the national rules worldwide are standardized on ICAO rules, flying internationally will become a much more simple activity. However, though the current applicability situation is complex, it is not illogical, and should not be beyond the capacity of a pilot to understand. The situation can be summarized using the following example concerning an aircraft registered in the United Kingdom. For a United Kingdom registered aircraft flying over the United Kingdom rules of the air apply. For a UK registered aircraft flying over, say, France, French and UK rules apply, but the French rules take precedence. For UK registered aircraft flying over the high seas, ICAO rules apply without exception. One important general principle which flight crew must bear in mind is that it is the pilot in command of an aircraft, whether he is manipulating the controls or not, who is responsible for the operation of the aircraft in accordance with the rules of the air. However, the pilot in command may depart from these rules in circumstances that render such departure absolutely necessary in the interests of safety. The rules of the air that we have been referring to up to now are the general rules covered by Annex II of the ICAO Chicago Convention. And these general rules are aimed at ensuring that aircraft operations are safe and expeditious. However, in addition to the general rules of the air, aircraft commanders are subject either to the visual flight rules, referred to frequently as VFR, or the instrument flight rules, commonly known as IFR. When airborne, a pilot will always be flying in accordance with either the visual flight rules or the instrument flight rules. Note that a pilot does not necessarily have to be flying by sole reference to his instruments when flying in accordance with the instrument flight rules. You will learn more about the instrument flight rules in a later lesson. A pilot who elects to fly in accordance with the visual flight rules must be able to maneuver and navigate his aircraft and maintain separation from other aircraft and from terrain by reference to features outside the cockpit. Consequently, VFR flight is possible only when in-flight visibility, cloud base, and separation from cloud meet certain defined minima. These minima are defined as visual meteorological conditions, most often referred to as VMC. VMC minima depend on the class of airspace an aircraft is flying in and the aircraft's altitude or flight level. You will learn more about that later. For the moment, it is sufficient for you to know that when a pilot is flying VFR, he must be in VMC. Flights not conducted in accordance with the visual flight rules must be conducted in accordance with the instrument flight rules. Such flights are commonly referred to as IFR flights. You will learn more about IFR flight later on. For now, it is sufficient to say that, in general terms, instrument flight rules exist to ensure that a pilot has adequate clearance from ground obstacles, and that his aircraft is safely separated from other aircraft in the vertical plane, according to the magnetic track being flown. This is done, again, as you will learn later, by assigning different specified cruising flight levels to aircraft depending on whether they are flying on a westerly or easterly track. On screen is a highly simplified representation of this principle. The need for safe separation, whether it be from terrain or from other aircraft, is of course essential when visual meteorological conditions do not prevail and a pilot is required to maneuver and navigate his aircraft by sole reference to instruments. Whenever visual meteorological conditions do not prevail, in other words, where VMC minima are not met, conditions are described as instrument meteorological conditions, more commonly known as IMC. Flight in IMC must be in accordance with the instrument flight rules. Nevertheless, it is important to remember, as we have mentioned before, that IFR flights can take place either in VMC or in IMC. For instance, a commercial airliner flying on international routes in Europe, following airways, will invariably always be flying in accordance with the instrument flight rules for the whole route, irrespective of visibility conditions. That is, irrespective of whether IMC or VMC prevail. One last point for you to note on the instrument flight rules is that IFR flight may apply to flight in both controlled airspace and uncontrolled airspace. The flight crew member, who is responsible in accordance with Annex 2 to the ICAO Convention for ensuring that an aircraft complies with the general rules of the air, as well as with VFR or IFR requirements, is the pilot in command, often referred to in air law terms as the PIC. The pilot in command also has the right to override the rules if it is absolutely necessary to do so for the safety of his aircraft. The Annex 2 ICAO definition of pilot in command is shown on screen here. The pilot in command of an aircraft is the pilot designated by the operator, or in the case of general aviation, the owner, as being in command and charged with the safe conduct of a flight. It is worthwhile citing at this point two other general rules from Annex 2 of the ICAO Convention. Before beginning a flight, the pilot in command of an aircraft must make himself familiar with all available information appropriate to the planned flight. This includes a careful study of current weather reports and forecasts, fuel requirements, and formulating an alternate course of action if the flight cannot be completed as planned. No person is to pilot an airplane or act as a flight crew member of an airplane whilst under the influence of any psychoactive substance, including alcohol or drugs, by reason of which that person's capacity to act is impaired. That completes the introductory lesson to rules of the air.